Evening all. First off, I must apologise for my attire. I appear to have come dressed as a folk singer. So, during the course of this video, which is quite a serious one, I will resist the urge to stick a finger in my ear and start singing about sailing off from Liverpool, never to be seen again. With that out of the way, I want to talk about the Hollywood 10, a little bit about Senator Joseph McCarthy, McCarthyism, as it has been dubbed. And my proposition is that although I generally agree with the statement McCarthy did nothing wrong, although we should always note that everybody does something wrong. But in the overall scheme of things, what Joseph McCarthy was doing was a good thing in trying to root out communists that were in the US government. But I would say that going after the Hollywood 10 and blacklisting suspected communists in Hollywood ended up being a net loss for the anti communist movement. I think it did, in the long term, more harm than good. So I'll explain why I think this. So, first of all, I want to clear up a few misconceptions about McCarthy and McCarthyism. These are widely held beliefs, and um, information comes to light that shows that the fight against communism in the 1940s and 50s was not a witch hunt, as being popularly described. There were genuine causes for alarm at the extent of how many Soviet agents and communist spies had actually infiltrated the US government over a 20-year period. So, first misconception that needs to be cleared up is the role of Joe McCarthy and Hollywood. And that is to say, there is no direct involvement of McCarthy in investigating and prosecuting and interrogating Hollywood scriptwriters, directors, producers, and actors, because McCarthy was a senator and his activities were done in the US Senate. His investigations centered around there. The Hollywood 10 were being investigated, interrogated by the House Un-American Activities Committee, which is a House of Representatives purview. So, uh, so McCarthy did not have direct involvement in going after Hollywood communists, as is widely believed. Who was involved in the House Un-American Activities Committee was Richard Nixon. And indeed, his investigations into the Soviet agent and communist infiltrator Al Hiss propelled Nixon's career, got him his shot at being vice president to Eisenhower. He was Eisenhower's vice president for 8 years. So that was very much Nixon's gig. Now, I've read Nixon's memoirs, and he talks a lot about that period when he was on the House Un-American Activities Committee, and he talks about the often close working relationship he had with McCarthy. But this is why I say McCarthy didn't have a direct involvement, but indirectly he would be talking to the House Un-American Activity Committee. He was talking with Nixon about communist investigations. So it is highly likely, given Nixon's memoirs, that the two men and the two committees were communicating with each other. So McCarthy would have known about the investigation into communist infiltration in Hollywood, and he would have had a lot of information about it. He probably would have even advised the House on what to do. So that's that misconception cleared up. And yes, there was definite communist infiltration in Hollywood, dating back to the 1930s. And you may have heard the phrase the Hollywood 10. This describes 10 prominent scriptwriters, producers, and directors whose connections with the Communist Party over a 20-year period ended up with them being blacklisted from working in Hollywood, although they found ways around that. And a lot of other actors and writers and directors found themselves likewise on a blacklist for a shorter period of time. But certainly in the popular mindset, these people were persecuted just because of their political beliefs. It wasn't quite like that. So let's go back to the 1930s when the communists had this plan to infiltrate Hollywood. Now, the plan was twofold. One was um, to put money and build structures of labor unions that would be indirectly influenced and funded by the Soviet Union. So it was getting labor unions organized in Hollywood. And this in turn would lead to kind of working conditions that were favorable to the Communist Party, having closed shops, having wielding some power and influence over the workforce in Hollywood. You couldn't get work unless you were in the union, and the union was very selective in membership and getting people organized. So if they needed to come out and strike, they would come out on strike. So this was being funded by the Soviet Union, and they put a lot of money into this. They also put a lot of money into boosting the Communist Party in America, in particular in Hollywood. It would be seen as a fertile ground for recruiting people to the communist cause. The arts have always tended to be quite liberal and left-leaning, but if the communists can get in there and make membership of the Communist Party an advantage for the career, then they were going to invest their time and money into doing that. Now, this is the 1930s. Let's paint the scene here. And one of the pervading moods in liberal democratic societies at that time was that liberal democracy was largely finished, traumatized by the Great War and now by the Great Depression. The idea that these weak democracies have they had their time, and all these greedy capitalists, are they squeezing the life out of the system? So the two extreme political ideologies of that era, communism and fascism, gave people a straight binary choice. Either you join with one or the other, communism or fascism. You can't be in this middle ground in a liberal democracy. That's dying. That's on the way out. So this was the appeal, in particular to the communists. The fascists weren't going to accept a bunch of wafty la-di-das in their ranks, but the communists would. So the arts were targeted by the communists, and these young people coming out of their colleges, coming out of their schools, being told that it's going to be a straight fight between communism and fascism, and come to the communist side, they were very impressionable, and a lot of them went, and they it's like a lot of how socialism appeals, and it's appealing to multiple levels in your mind, from your sense out of your sense of compassion, out of your sense of fair play and justice. It kind of gets warped by the communist lens, and it ends up becoming something horrific and murderous. But if you're young and impressionable and you want a little bit of justice, you want a little bit of fairness, you want a little bit more equality in the world, that's how they hook you in and reel you in. And it's no different than these artistes in the 1930s. Now, here's where I think the Soviet Union got it wrong in the long term. And the fact is, they didn't have a proper appreciation for how the Hollywood system worked. I mean, as Hollywood as a economic industrial system worked. And that's hardly surprising, because if we go back even further in time, and let's choose the year 1917, when the communists take over Russia, and we have a look at the state of the Russian film industry in 1917 and the American film system in 1917, and you'll see a stark difference. Well, for one thing, there is no Russian film industry in 1917. It's mainly a bunch of individuals and privateers. There is no huge industrialized mechanism. But in Hollywood, it's by 1917, the studio system, as we kind of understand it today, was established. From about, I would say, 1909 through to 1917, there is this period of rapid technological and business structure way in Hollywood. The studio system happens, run by the big moguls, people like Jack Warner, Thomas Ince, Louis B. Mayer, amongst others. And they have this, following on from Henry Ford's kind of revolutionary production line method, the Hollywood studio system becomes technical and industrialized. Everybody's got their jobs, their departments, and it functions like a conveyor belt. You write the script, you assemble the cast, you shoot the film, you edit the film, and you release the film. It's this industrialized process, and it becomes extremely profitable. This is the business model for filmmaking, and the other thing, the language of cinema that we know it, the editing techniques, the filming techniques, that people come in from one edge of frame, they've got to leave the other. You can't cross the line, as it's called. These principles are established in Hollywood in the 1910s. And by 1917, Hollywood is a remarkably industrialized, efficient, and productive industry where the Soviet Union has nothing. And in the 1920s, this builds up even more. Hollywood becomes internationally famous. It is the place to go if you want to make big films. And the films are becoming bigger, longer, more elaborate, more technically sophisticated, and it's making a huge amount of money. Now, at this stage, we don't have left-wing infiltration of Hollywood in the 1920s, but we do have an extremely liberal environment. In fact, the Hollywood of the 1920s is extremely decadent. If you read the history about it, you'll discover things like there's murders, there's rapes, gang rapes. There is a huge amount of scandal that is all covered up because they've got the Hollywood press, the gossip columns become an industry, and Hollywood develops a system like a film star like Fatty Arbuckle is caught in a compromising position, and he gets thrown under a bus because they want to save somebody else's career who has done something perhaps even more heinous, like murder a film producer on a yacht, allegedly. But they're more important, so their career's got to be saved, and that person can be thrown under a bus. This becomes very involved and in depth, very decadent, which is why in 1932 you have the Hays Code comes in. If you actually, as an aside, go and watch a lot of early sound films from about 1928 to 1932, you'll be shocked at how permissive the films of the very early 1930s are. There's blood, there's gore, there's sex, there's every kind of decadence under the sun in those what's called pre-code films. And then the decency code comes in, and everything's got to reflect good American family values, and it's got to be moral. You've got to have moral in the story, and you can't shoot. There was rules like you can't shoot somebody and have show blood in the shot. So this was Hollywood in the 1930s, and this is the Hollywood that the Soviet Union are trying to infiltrate with communists. And they do. They put these communists in, Hollywood 10, start their careers in this time period. But they're entering a world of a highly structured, industrialized, profit motive Hollywood, run by these moguls that, although socially permissive, are producing a product that's going to appeal to middle America. This is the Hollywood 10, the communists that get into Hollywood, the script writers, directors, producers, and actors find a system that is very robust in stopping their excesses, which is why you don't get a lot of films in that era with a heavy socialist or communist message. Let me give you an example. Let's have a look at the Hollywood 10 now. And there's some quite well-known names if you know your film history. So, one person, I've forgotten his name. Be right back. Right, I found my name. So we've got here, I've got up on the screen, a scriptwriter called Lester Cole. Now, Lester Cole, one of his most famous film credits is Objective Burma, an Errol Flynn film about a bunch of American paratroopers going into Burma to fight the Japanese. Much criticised at the time because Errol Flynn, for reasons that were very personal to him, refused to enlist in any armed force in World War II. And also, Burma was really the British's gig, so why a bunch of American paratroopers swanning around in a Hollywood film about it? But anyway, this is case in point. There's others. The scriptwriter for High Noon, hardly a communist film. People didn't go in 1950 as kind of traditional conservative Americans to watch High Noon and come out thinking, communism. Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. See, the films themselves are quite good quality. Some of them get nominated for Academy Awards, but they're hardly what you would call subversive left-wing propaganda films. Even the most left-wing of the Hollywood 10 is Dalton Trumbo. And the thing about Trumbo is that during the he doesn't actually officially join the Communist Party until 1946, although he was very much a communist and a communist sympathizer before then. But he actually officially joins the party in 46. And the script he's producing, again, are very mainstream. These people are being hired for the quality of their writing in general, but the studio system said, right, we need a war propaganda film that make our American soldiers look good. You go and write that. Or we need a women's emotional drama. Go and write that. The studio execs would put they would control the kind of output. It's not like these communist scriptwriters would say, look, I've got a script about a workers' revolt in Indiana, and the studios would make that. The studios wouldn't make that. That's the point. So they were very much shackled by the Hays Code, by the studio mogul system. And so they're despite their personal communist political leanings, their output, their professional output, is limited. Now, Dalton Trumbo is an interesting case because in 1939 he writes one of the most harrowing anti-war novels perhaps ever written. It's called Johnny Got His Gun. In 1913, he wrote that in 1939, and his publisher was very reluctant to publish it. It eventually did get published, and then Trumbo, long after the Hollywood blacklisting and the communist investigations in Hollywood had ended in 1971, he got to adapt his own novel and direct it for the screen. And let me tell you, that's a film I'm never going to watch again. It is extremely harrowing. But I've got to be fair to a story like Johnny Got His Gun. It's the most anti-war film I think I've ever seen because it deals with horrific disfigurement. I mean, a lot of war dramas, you either survive mentally scarred or it deals with being killed. Johnny Got His Gun deals with horrific disfigurement. But you can't say that's communist propaganda. This happened. There is a whole horrible history about World War One disfigurement, the birth of plastic surgery, the birth of prosthetics that happened in the 1920s and 30s to deal with these horrifically disfigured veterans. Johnny Got His Gun is a little bit along those lines. Although it has a bit more of a political message. But as I said, the film comes out in 1971, where the cinema audience is already primed for that kind of thing. Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself in the story. So anyway, the House Un-American Activities Committee go after the Hollywood 10 and a whole bunch of other actors, directors, screenwriters. But here's where the debate about how appropriate it was to investigate Hollywood, and the committee and the kind of the interrogation that was filmed in front of the cameras and the aftermath. This is where we can start getting into the debate about whether it was effective or not. Because on the one hand, what McCarthy was doing in the Senate, going after communist infiltrators in the State Department, was a matter of national security. It has been shown that there were certain high communists in the State Department who worked themselves up to quite a high level, and they were adversely affecting American foreign policy and getting it to favour communists in China, in particular, in Southeast Asia. So that was a genuine cause for concern and had to be dealt with. Hollywood, on the other hand, is different because, one, it's not government, it is private corporations. But the argument goes, you've got to go after these communists because it is an entertainment media that's reaching out to millions of people. Millions of people will be watching these films and could be influenced by them. But I would argue that although technically that's a reasonable case to be made, you've got to look at the effect. And were the films that these communist scriptwriters and producers making, were they subversive, pro-communist, and were they having an effect on the American public's mind? And I would argue no. If you've got films like High Noon or some of these other, I'm trying to think of some off the top of my head. One of the blacklisted writers ended up writing The Guns of Navarone. Again, not a communist film. So the studio system is restricting these communists' ability to push their message. There's always the restraining hand of the big industry, of the media moguls who have got their fingers on the pulse of what the American public want. And you can look at American attitudes in the 1950s towards communism, and it is staunchly anti-communist for the most part throughout the 50s and going into the 60s. So there wasn't a subversion of the American public's minds at that time. Now, here's the thing. You can say, what about in the late 60s, going into the 70s? Even today, we have some of the most left-wing, self-righteous, social justice, pro-socialist films coming out of Hollywood. These woke films, isn't that an effect? Well, it is, but it's not. I would argue it's not because of communist infiltration that was done by the Soviet Union in the 1930s. You see, what happened is that we have this view of McCarthyism shaped by the persecution of the Hollywood 10, going after the Hollywood 10, these communists in Hollywood. And that shocked people. And we forget about the genuine communist infiltration, the serious security risk of the State Department, or maybe the Pentagon, or the Department of Agriculture. That was another one that was infiltrated heavily. So the genuine good work of rooting out communists from the government has been forgotten about, and now it's been replaced with, the US government went after a bunch of scriptwriters in a private Hollywood business. And I would argue that had the US government just left it alone, just said, okay, these people, we know that they're communists, let's just keep an eye on them, let's keep a discreet eye on them. We have a line in the sand, and if they cross that line in the sand, right, then we can go after them. If they're trying to foment labour unrest, if they're trying to overthrow the government, we have this line, okay, and if they cross that line, we go after them. But if they're not, we just observe them from the distance. And so you're not making them martyrs, you're not making them a cause celebre. You don't get people on the kind of, say, centre and centre-left feeling sorry for them because they're being denied their ability to work. Had they been producing overtly communist films, it might have been a different matter. But you want to go after the cast and crew of High Noon because of their private beliefs. This is where the propaganda war was lost, and we're paying for that. The generation that came along after the 1950s, the ones that made their names in the late 60s, going into the 70s, these are the first products, the products of the first American film schools, which start in the late 50s, early 60s. They're the first fruits. Before then, you had to go in a very entry-level job in the film industry and work your way up. But now you got film schools, and they're all hearing the mythology about McCarthyism. You know, it's the truth about McCarthy and the communist investigations have been warped, and it becomes a story about martyrdom and persecution, and the propaganda war's been lost. So that group of liberals that emerge, and their left wing ideas are not shaped by films; they are shaped more by their education. So the educational establishments are mostly responsible for shaping their political opinion. And so it goes on. And now we have a very historically distorted image of McCarthy and investigations of communist infiltration because everybody focuses on the films. And I would say if he had left the Hollywood 10 alone and just watched them discreetly from a distance, we wouldn't be in this situation now where we have, even after, long after the Soviet Union is gone, we have an industry that is so in the grip of hard left ideology, and the studio moguls have gone. The old moguls have gone. They've been replaced by boardrooms and committees, and people looking to tick boxes rather than have a clear vision of creating a mighty industry. So that about wraps it up. So that is my proposition, that that going after Hollywood for communist infiltration ended up being a propaganda loss for anti-communism, and it has cost us in the long term. So until next time, I'm just going to leave you with signing off from Liverpool, never to be seen again.